Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for putting up with my unbelievable disorganization. I got here and didn't pay my taxi, just FYI. So if you have a taxi on the way out, just give him a little extra out of goodwill because, yeah, his credit card didn't work. I'm Danielle Pletka. I'm the Senior Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And I also, for my sins, am a professor at Georgetown teaching in the Center for Jewish Civilization, thanks to that man in the corner who's hiding away, and the School of Foreign Service, which is the pleasure of my job. I have the honor to be seated next to, and I'm going to use their bios because otherwise I'm not going to get the full flavor of their scholarship. Bart, I would say Bonikowski, but you probably say Bonikowski.
I answer to either.
Good, who's an associate professor of sociology at Harvard and resident faculty at the Minda de Gunzburg Center for European Studies. This is too much. A faculty affiliate of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, where you co-direct. Do you know what you co-direct?
I think so.
The Research Cluster on Global Populism and the Future of Democracy. And you are a 2018-19 Leonore Annenberg and Wallace Annenberg Fellow in Communications at Stanford. Kudos. We're going to be talking about the issues. You're going to do honor to your bio. Ben Hett earned a JD at the University of Toronto in 1990. He practiced litigation, but we like him anyway, in Canada for 4 years before earning a PhD in history at Harvard. He's taught at Harvard College, Harvard Law School, and since 2003 at Hunter College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Both are authors of well-known works, and we're really here to talk about the challenge of white supremacy, some of the historical roots, the nexus with some of the other racial and anti-religious challenges that we see today. And what I'd like to do is, if I can ask you both briefly to just talk a little bit about your theory of the matter. And when you do that, please tie it into the threats and the challenges that we face up to today. You can fight over who goes first.
Maybe we can go in kind of chronological order, and I'm the historian, so maybe, and then I'll let Bart say anything that's actually relevant to.
It's always the lawyer who gets
right
his
now.
foot
That
in
works
first.
for me. Gives me a second.
All right. Well, maybe I could start with this. So I've written several books. The most recent is on the fall of the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Nazis, which actually is a bit of an obsession with me. I seem to keep going back and writing about it. So a few lights have gone off in my head today in our discussion. So I want to actually start by kind of referring to a couple points that have come up that I think are relevant to something I've been struggling to say in some of my writing, which right in the first panel, there was some discussion about humiliation as a political driver. And I have sort of come to the conclusion that that may be the most powerful thing. And there's a lot of it going on in Germany in the 1920s and the early 30s. On a lot of levels. On a national level, the country had experienced a shocking and catastrophic military defeat with the cost of about 1.7 million soldiers killed in action. I like to tell my students, relative to population, multiply this out, and this would be like the United States having a war right now and losing 8 million soldiers killed in action, and you lose. Imagine what that would do to our politics. And then in the lives of ordinary people, there were several different kinds of economic disaster between 1919 and 1933, and particularly it was bad for young people because there had been a kind of baby boom between 1900 and 1910. So to be a young person in the 20s was really a bad deal. Very hard or impossible to find a job. Hard to find apprenticeships. Post-secondary education is overcrowded. And so you have masses of people who are generally feeling, we have been shafted by our country, we've been shafted by the economy, we've been shafted by the world. And then along comes the political movement, and this really ties into some themes we've had today. Along comes the political movement that says, you're not a loser, you're not a failure. You are a hero simply by virtue of being German. Put on this uniform and come with us and follow us, and you are great, and your true greatness will emerge. And that's going to be a very powerful force. The other thing that I want to say, in the last panel, Professor Lauer brought up the question of, why now? And I'm going to trespass slightly into your territory by way of lead-in, probably to Bart's comments. But I actually have a theory about why now, and it may well be wrong. But my theory is that in a mellow and gentle way, and I want to stress that, we are recapitulating some of the elements of crisis of Germany in the 1920s and early 30s. Nowhere near the full scale, certainly of what happened after World War I in Germany, but in a mild way, yes, and in particular in the sense of humiliation. And I think economic developments are important here. I think whenever you see the rise of most forms of nasty extremist politics, there's usually an economic problem at the root of it, but I think the causation is somewhat indirect. And my theory is it's not per se the economic problem, it's the humiliation that goes with the consequences of economic bad luck that drives the kind of rage that can fuel a political extremist movement. And I think, you know, there's abundant data to show that in the United States, since about the middle of the 1970s, real incomes for most people have stagnated, while there has been epic growth in the top 1% and super epic growth in the top 0.1%. And you can't do that forever without people getting a bit tetchy. But also partly because of the humiliation factor. So I think that's part of it. There are probably some other things. You know, certainly the end of the Cold War took away a certain backdrop to American political life. The internet, I'm sure we've talked about that a lot today. The internet and the communications possibilities that has opened up is a part of that. But I do think, and this was sort of the thread of the book that I just wrote on the Weimar Republic, in Germany, in the period after World War I, you have a global economy that seems to be really dumping on Germany, and Germans feel that they are really victims. They're sort of the football for world political currents that they can't control, and that was oxygen to the Nazis. And that I think is where there is a parallel that has real bite to our political situation right now. And so with that, the guy who actually knows this stuff will turn it over to Bart.
So I'm going to push back the why now question until a little later because I think we're going to be asked about it in more detail. I study nationalism as in the way that people understand their nations and how that affects their political behavior and preferences. I study populism as a way of making political claims, both in the United States and Europe. And so what's been really interesting for me today is that we've been talking a lot about white supremacist movements, about extremist organizations, about sort of some of which have, you know, in their ancestry the KKK, et cetera. And these are extremely important organizations that we should be studying. And in some ways, they used to be mainstream. They sort of were relegated to a fringe, and now they've come back into the mainstream again. So we've got the mainstreaming of extremism. But at the same time, we've got the radicalization of the mainstream, and I think we should be talking about both together. On the former, you know, a lot of the movements that we've been talking about have been sanitized. There is increasingly a use of mainstream clothing brands that have a sort of an extremist, coded extremist messages. There is kind of dressing better, you know, better haircuts. There are New York Times profiles on Richard Spencer and how well dressed he is, and isn't that interesting? And so there's been sort of this normalization and legitimization of these movements by the media, but of course also by our political leaders. And that brings me to the latter point, and that is that at the same time as these extreme movements have become more mainstream, the mainstream itself has shifted. And I think that an exclusive focus on just the extremist organizations misses the importance of the fact that Trump was not elected, for example, by just a few white nationalists on the extremes, on the fringes. He was elected by over 50% of Americans. Well, we can talk about the popular vote, electoral college, right? But the point is that he was elected by the American people. And rather than focusing on the fringe, let's think about the fact that in my research, for example, 50% of Americans think that to be American, you have to be essentially white. You have to be born here, you have to have ancestry here, you have to be Christian, et cetera. Interestingly, that proportion hasn't really changed in the last 20 years. And in fact, if you look at the trends in sort of overall ethno-nationalism or openness to immigrants in Europe and the United States, there's actually a lot of stability or improvement, if you see as improvement, greater inclusivity. So what's changed? Well, a few things have changed. One is that this reservoir of ethno-nationalist beliefs has become activated. It's become mobilized. It's become a salient source of decision-making at the ballot box and elsewhere, and in terms of intergroup interactions on the streets of our cities and towns. But also another thing that I'm finishing up a paper on, these different understandings of what the nation means, different understandings of who's a legitimate member of the nation, of what aspects of the nation we should or shouldn't be proud of how the nation compares to other countries around the world. These are all these ideas are what constitute these schemas of the nation or conceptions of nationhood that I study. These have been increasingly sorted by party, and this is an extremely important thing to think about. In the 1990s, data from 1996, you could not tell what party somebody belongs to in the United States based on what they thought the nation meant. and vice versa. If you knew what party they belonged to, you didn't know what their definition of nationhood was. By 2016, 75% of Republicans are ethno-nationalist. Okay? That's a lot. Among strong Republicans, it's 78%. Among weak Republicans, it's around 70%. So now, if you look at the graph of essentially association between partisan identity and partisan identification and nationalist beliefs, the association skyrockets from almost zero in the 90s, in single digits, to a really, really high association by the late 2010s. In Europe, it's something similar, except it's not a two-party system. So the polarization is between traditional parties and non-traditional parties. And you also have a massive increase in the relationship between ethno-nationalist conceptions of nationhood and party ID. And so we essentially have had this joint process where you've got the polarization of nationalism across parties, and you've got the greater salience of nationalism as a source of political decision-making among the public, which then leads to the election or the greater power of radical right politicians, which then has knock-on effects for the stability of liberal democracy. And I guess that's the topic of our panel, so I'm not going to go on for the next 20 minutes about it. I'll just punt it back to you, and we can talk about what the consequences of such developments might be for the way that our democracy functions.
Right. So there are 1,000 questions I want to answer. I want to ask you, and I'm just going to pretend you all are not here, because this is really interesting for me. Now, I'm a Republican and a conservative, so I'm going to. That puts us in an interesting position. Let's start with history because it's easier and because you're closest to me, and I can smack you if I disagree.
All right.
Good. So one of the theories that you posit, which I think has a lot of sort of trenchant connection to this to the current era, is this, as you said, the sort of feeling of being either victimized or left behind. More importantly, perhaps not even that, but that someone has taken something away from you. It's not just that society has moved on, the economy has moved on, and I don't have the skill set or I don't have the job. It's not bad luck. It is that someone did this to me. Okay. Now, unlike in Germany, where there was actually a crime of World War I being punished in the Versailles Treaty, we have here a group of people who weren't being punished, but who felt like the elites left them behind, that they had forgotten about them, whether it was NAFTA or what is sort of popularly called globalization, which is a catch-all for everything that some people don't like. Pull the thread a little bit on this, and particularly, it's very easy for us and nice for us to sort of label people and toss them off in a bucket and call them deplorables. If I may use a term that I just thought of. But there is this genuine problem, and government, which represents all the people, has to deal with that in a particular way. In Germany, government was actually dysfunctional. Weimar produced Hitler because Weimar was dysfunctional government. Hitler was choice number 5, not choice number 1. Help us understand how this dysfunction, this government, and the disconnect really fundamentally between government and people may be a factor here.
Wow. Okay.
Not to ask it in a way that you didn't like.
No. No. I like the question. I'm just thinking it's going to take me 5 hours to answer it, and you're all going to be super unhappy with me. So let me try and do the soundbite version on this. I must admit I don't quite buy a couple of your starting premises. So
me being a conservative?
That I'm fine with that.
Thank you.
I have some of my best friends are conservatives.
Some of my best friends are limousine liberals.
No doubt. Now you made me lose my train of thought.
Weimar being left
Weimar was
behind.
actually, I would question the premise that Weimar was a dysfunctional state. It was actually, Weimar had about 5 good years when it was very functional. There were several things made it dysfunctional. I would argue that it did not die so much as it was killed. It was set problems to solve that most states would struggle to solve. I mean, it had to solve several different economic crises that any government would have trouble with. It was dumped in an international situation that was unfavorable. You referred to the Versailles Treaty punishing the crime of World War I. However one may see that, the treaty is still debated. I can guarantee you 99% of Germans didn't think there had been a crime that was being punished. They thought, in fact, the treaty was a crime and that they had been pushed into a war and then got blamed for losing it. So across the board, across the political spectrum in Germany, the treaty was hated and it was seen as one of the manifestations of what the world is doing to them that isn't fair. But things could have taken a very different turn. I mean, I agree with you that Hitler was approximately choice number 5 as a political outcome. And, you know, most historians would say that up until maybe sometime in the year 1932, if you had asked any German, what's the most likely political outcome of the political crisis that we're in, virtually no one would have said Hitler. You know, a military dictatorship might have looked like a reasonably probable outcome. But in the final analysis, once the state hit a crisis, it hit a crisis because it got killed by certain powerful interests who had decided that the state wasn't working for them. It's chiefly the army and big business who decide that the sort of stable Weimar of the mid-20s isn't working well enough for them. Wage settlements are too high. Big business was being driven crazy by wage settlements, in which the state had a fair hand through a wage arbitration system. And the army is being driven nuts by the fact that they are limited to 100,000 soldiers under the Treaty of Versailles and no Air Force and no submarines and all this kind of stuff. And they get permanently ticked off with Weimar when in 1929 the parliament refuses to vote money to build a battleship. And at this point the military decides, that's it, this democracy isn't happening, let's get rid of it. And to make a long story somewhat short, the most convenient ally for them at this point, and certainly the big vote getter, turns out to be Hitler. So Hitler comes into power and the Nazis come into power as sort of a alliance of people who don't like him, it is important to say. The traditional German elites look at this guy and they say, as President von Hindenburg said, he never made it beyond private in the war. He's from Austria.
He did make it beyond private, but he was demoted to private.
Well, he made it from private to private first class.
But you are being an historian, which I love and appreciate, and I know our audience does too. But what I'm trying to get to is actually a question that I think has some resonance for today, and that is the disconnect between the public and its government. That there is a substantial element of the public that doesn't believe that its government is serving it well, and that it needs to turn to these, I think, what we can all legitimately call fringe parties and fringe elements that are going to, upend the status quo and put things right for us. And there,
yeah, let me just very quickly say something. I think you got to break down the word public a little bit because no country has a public, right? We don't here in this country. Certainly Germany in the 20s did not. And one of the things I think is fascinating and really important to grasp is who was voting for the Nazis when they had a choice, especially early on when you really sort of starkly see the patterns of who's a Nazi and who's not coming out. And who was is really interesting because it was people in rural areas who were Protestant. Basically, that's why. And the reasons are not too hard to see. There was a red state, blue state distinction basically in Weimar Germany, which is very familiar from our context. People in rural areas, they look to the big cities, notably Berlin, and they see places that are diverse, where there's a modern economy happening, where people look down their noses at them, where now, since the end of World War I and a revolution, there are socialists in charge, and socialists are all urban, and they're kind of all Jews as far as people in rural areas are concerned. They certainly don't seem to be Christian. It's not us. It used to be us in power, now it's not us, and they do feel they're being left behind. So that's a section of the public, that's a segment of the population that does feel it, as you put, really not served and not represented and not heard in their government. There were others that did, and that's why there was a fight. I mean, there were people who were 100% behind the Republic. There were fewer by the end, but there was always a democratic constituency in Germany. If there wasn't, you'd have a hard time explaining why Germany's been a stable democracy for 70 years since 1949. So I mean, that constituency was always there. And just to sort of finish the thought, I mean, we have the same situation now. I mean, we have a divided public. We have people who loathe Trump. We have people who loathe Hillary Clinton. We have everything. Everything is contested and divided. There are different kinds of people who are going to go different kinds of ways, and politics is always all about, do I have these? Can I get enough of these to win? And what do I need to say to do that, basically?
Can I just pick up on that?
Exactly.
Because
Yeah,
there's
please.
before we get to the disconnect from the government, the initial claim was that this is about economic dislocation, and I just want to touch on that for a second. So there is some truth to that. There's research by economists, Metallo Colantone, by Luigi Giso, and others that shows that indeed, if you look at localities where the China trade shock has been the strongest, or localities have been the most affected by capital mobility in Europe, you do see a greater proportion of votes for radical candidates. So there is some truth to that. At the same time, that effect is quite small and far outshadowed by other concerns. And so actually, if you look at the support from many radical parties, yes, it's outside of urban centers, but it's often in suburbs and exurbs and in small towns and rural areas. But it's not among the poor for most part. Actually, in terms of income, there's quite a wide range, and the mean is pretty high. There is an education effect for sure, correlation there as well. But the point is that there's been a long debate both in the public sphere and among scholars between the economic theory of radical right support and the quote-unquote cultural theory of radical right support. And the cultural theory gets reduced to essentially racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, et cetera. The culture side has empirically pretty much won the battle in this case. So there's more evidence for the fact that it is these sort of out-group hostilities that drive support for radical right candidates more so than economic concerns. But it's really a false dichotomy, I would argue, because it assumes that the economy is not culturally interpreted. It assumes that culture is reducible to just xenophobia. And it's actually a lot more complicated than that. There are many economic shocks that don't get interpreted and then channeled into out-group hostility. Regular booms and busts of the economy are seen as okay. It is particular kinds of economic shocks that are then viewed as unfair to people like me. Not even necessarily to me. This is the key point. So a lot of the concerns that are driving radical right voters are not individual sort of concerns. They're not concerns driven by their own personal experience necessarily. They're what we call sociotropic concerns. They're concerns for people like me. And when I'm putting this in air quotes for a reason, the like me gets filled in by very obvious socio-demographic characteristics, very often race. And so if we think about it a little more broadly like this, what it turns out is that, as essentially you're alluding to, or explicitly stating, that it's about kind of a sense of self-worth, and it's particularly about a sense of racial status threat. It is a sense that whites who have been in a privileged and dominant position are being threatened in the racial hierarchy by other groups. Now, this is not to say that whites are no longer privileged. Obviously, they're still at the top, right? But there's a sense, both real and perceived, that there is a threat. What is this generated by? It's actually multi-causal, and this is where it gets really tricky, especially if you do comparison across cases. It's economic crises, but it's also demographic crises, real and imagined. The idea that the US will become a minority-majority nation at some point soon turns out to be have a huge effect on people's support for the Tea Party and later for Trump. It is about terrorism, and then the connection that's made by opportunistic elites between immigration and terrorism. It is about cultural changes, the idea that people in urban coastal centers in the US are dictating how I'm to speak, how I'm to think, what I'm allowed to talk about at the dinner table. Again, I personally find a lot of the changes to be either fabricated or not necessarily negative, but when they're articulated and interpreted in particular ways by very influential political elites in the media and by politicians, a lot of the anxieties that result are then channeled into out-group resentments, right? So you don't like all of these things that are happening to people like you, and maybe to you as well. Well, you should blame the minorities that are getting an unfair advantage in our economy or in our university admissions and so forth. It is because people like you, that is white people, are becoming increasingly becoming losers over time. And I think the fact that it's this collective status that's driving this across the cases with different stimuli kind of causing it, but inevitably channeled by elites into out-group resentment is really, really crucial. And some of these crises are real, some of these changes are real, but a lot of them are fabricated or amplified and exaggerated by elites and then tied together into a neat package. That essentially, what it does, and I'll finish with this, it takes this, I mentioned that a good chunk of the population is and has always been ethno-nationalist. That ethno-nationalism is usually latent. It's usually not acted upon because other issues are more important, other identities are more important. But when you've got this kind of mix of changes that are then very loudly amplified by elites and blamed on outgroups, you're raising the importance of ethno-nationalism and national identification more generally, and you're activating and mobilizing this 40, 50% of the population, maybe less in some countries, that really believes that the nation should be ethnically pure.
You think it's 40 or 50% that
In the
believe it?
United States, it's 50%. Now, I mean, I can tell you specifically what the questions are and what I mean by that. So these are not people who are throwing Molotov cocktails through, synagogue windows. These are people for whom basically what it means to be American is to have American ancestry, to have lived here all their lives. It is to be Christian, and so forth, right? It's to have a pretty exclusionary and ascriptive sense of who belongs and who does not, as opposed to an inclusive one, which is much more sort of elective and changeable.
So let me press you. You touched on this in the beginning, and I think this is, I couldn't agree with you more, and I call this phenomenon the politicization of everything. Right, it's not just politics. It's who you like, and it's also what burgers you eat and what restaurants you frequent. It is things that we would never have thought about 20, 30 years ago. And as you rightly say, a lot of these views are latent. So there are things that frankly weren't acceptable in polite society that suddenly people have become much more comfortable with. And I find that a real left-right phenomenon. In other words, it was 20 years ago, the threshold for calling someone a racist was much higher. The threshold for anti-Hispanic or anti-black or white nationalist epithets was, you didn't hear them, frankly. Even though people may have thought them or believed them, you didn't hear them. Certainly people didn't go in parades except in Skokie. I mean, the fact that I remember Skokie tells you how much of an outlier something like that was. And yet in Charlottesville, you have this group of people who, are white nationalists and who want to, don't keep the country away from the Jews. To what do you attribute this this surfacing, if you will? Because again, lots of people have terrible thoughts. We all have had one terrible thought that is unacceptable about somebody today if you were in traffic in Washington, D.C. Right? I mean, just because, but you didn't stand up and tweet it, and you didn't articulate it because you knew that this is not acceptable, and then you felt bad afterwards, by the way. So don't tell us what that thought was, but where does this come from?
I appreciate the sort of a-partisan appeal and sort of beginning of your statements, and I wish I could fully pull that thread through, but I don't think it's symmetrical across the parties. Okay, to say that now Democrats are calling people, or people, let's say on the left, whatever, Democrats or not Democrats, are people calling racist much sort of more readily than before. To compare that to the fact that the day after the election I had students crying in my office because on the streets of Cambridge people were throwing racial slurs at them and telling them to get off the back of the bus or go to the back of the bus.
You're worrying about the well-being of Harvard students?
Yeah.
Got it.
Actually, so Harvard students, as you may know, get 100% needs-based funding, and a lot of them come from various backgrounds. In sociology in particular, we get a very wide diversity of students. I'm talking about students of color who the day after the election had racial slurs thrown them on the streets of Cambridge. Now, this is anecdotal evidence, but there are statistics that we heard from our keynote speaker today about the increase in hate crimes, but the increase in harassment and other forms of violence. The point is, why did this all of a sudden, why was the lid blown open? I mean, that, to me, doesn't seem to be a mystery. When you've got a campaign predicated on the free voicing of these kinds of ideas.
So your view is that this is Donald Trump's fault?
No. So yes and no. Yes, it is absolutely Donald Trump's fault. And by the way, this is not a Republican-Democratic thing specifically, because many Republicans had no desire to have Trump in office. So but now the situation is slightly different. No, this is Trump legitimated and normalized certain ways of talking. I mean, this is just a fact. It's not. There's nothing to argue about, right? The way that he conducted his campaign was unprecedented in the last few decades, right? So all of a sudden, you're as somebody who holds these latent views, you're being told, wait, it's okay. The president or the president-to-be is saying this. I can now say this around my dinner table. Wait, I can say it on the street. Wait, I can vote on it. I mean, this is a completely different world. So you're essentially changing what is normatively acceptable, but it's not Trump's fault in the sense that he didn't create this, right? So I think what's really important to remember is that if we think of American history, and this was already talked about a little bit earlier, as a history of liberal progress with a few exceptions along the way, then this doesn't make sense. But that's not the reality. So if you look at the work of Roger Smith, for instance, sort of a multiple traditions approach to national political culture. In the United States, there have always been competing definitions of nationhood, including an explicitly white supremacist one, that have been competing for power and for dominance, and they've sort of vacillated in which one has been dominant at any given time. And so this stuff has been around for forever in terms of American history. It hasn't always been dominant. And when political entrepreneurs embrace these kinds of beliefs and ideologies, give them legitimacy and give them voice, then all of a sudden that activates those beliefs among the public.
So I want.
And by the way, that happened before Trump, because the Republican Party has been dog whistling for a while, right?
Oh,
on
of
and
course,
off, on and
naturally.
off. No, I mean.
Right. Of course, no, I see it. I grew up in Brookline, so I absolutely see that. I just want to pull from you though this question of whether this might go back and become. So is it, you said the Pandora's box is open, and I think a lot of us feel like that's the correct analogy. So the question is, can we close Pandora's box? I mean, Greek history would tell us, well, Greek mythology would tell us no. And then I want to come to you because I want to ask a little bit about the nexus with anti-Semitism, because I think that's a really important question. Not all nasty goes together, but in this case, it has seemed to. So just Pandora's box, just briefly.
One brief thing before that. This is not a partisan issue. I just want to be very clear. It's an issue of decency, in the sense that there are countless Republicans who did not play this game. Okay, and then there were some who did. And
countless Democrats who do play that game.
Who play the race baiting game.
Who play that game.
Okay. Anyway, so Pandora's box.
But not partisan.
So Pandora's box. It's hard to predict the future. I think it's very difficult to close the box. I think there are various possible scenarios. I think there's a good chance that Donald Trump will be reelected, and it's unclear what would happen after that. But even if he weren't reelected, then the question is, do we just come back to status quo ante right after that? And I'm not sure that we do, because a lot of change has occurred in just the last few years, and some of it is about what's allowable discourse, and that's certainly important and powerful. But some of it is about policy, it's about court stacking, it's about all kinds of things we've been talking about today, and it's about the fact that it's hard for a party that has doubled down on this way of doing politics to step back and say, okay, listen, we're going to go back to the thing we were talking about 10 years ago, which is embracing Latino voters and doing outreach to African American voters. It's possible, but it's hard, and parties don't tend to change overnight.
Right, they're very sclerotic. Right, absolutely. So now, especially when we talk about history, this nexus with anti-Semitism, I don't want us to, and I'm going to open up to questions in just a moment, but I don't want to let us go without talking a little bit about this nexus, because it doesn't always go together. In Europe in particular, we see a lot of Jeremy Corbyn, left-wing, virulent anti-Semitism. In Germany and France, the same. Why are these two great tastes that go great together in America?
Yeah, it's true that anti-Semitism has historically fluctuated back and forth, left and right. It was, prior to about the 1890s in Europe, it was pretty much a left issue, and then it went over to the right through most of the 20th century, and now it does seem to be emerging on the left in various ways. I think in the first panel this morning, I think it was Father Dubois who made the point that the hate doesn't always come first, and I think certainly in thinking about the Nazis, and I think probably in thinking about our current political environment, this is an important thing to think about. There's an Israeli historian whose work I think is terrific, and I rely on quite a bit for this kind of stuff, named Shulamit Volkov, who has made the argument, to try and boil it down a little bit, that in early 20th century Germany, anti-Semitism wasn't so much a kind of primary issue for a lot of people as it was a kind of rhetorical glue that held together a whole package of other things. Anti-modernism in general, militarism, nationalism, hyper-masculinism, anti-socialism, all of these things could be articulated in a vocabulary of anti-Semitism, because in some ways Jews sort of became a kind of political and rhetorical symbol for everything else. And so if you look at German politics through the 30 years or so before Hitler comes to power, you see it's kind of interesting, and I would say it in a way, to get a sense of what this is about, it's a little bit like what the abortion debate does in American politics, in the sense that where you come down on abortion is very often the determinant as to whether you go this way or that way. So it's sort of both parties have sort of set it up so that if you want to be pro-choice, you're a Democrat. If you want to be pro-life, you're a Republican. And then everything else kind of flows from that. Anti-Semitism was a bit like that in German politics pre-1933. If you're going to be anti-Semitic, you go this way. You go towards the nationalist right. If you want to be anti-Semitic, you go this way. You go to the democratic center or left. There was the great German socialist leader pre-World War I, a guy named August Bebel, had a lovely line in which he said, anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. It's a kind of anti-elite rhetoric of people who think they're being kind of populist, but they're wrong. Their conception is wrong, because of course he would say they should be socialist, so they haven't got it right. And that sort of illustrates the dividing line, I think, that anti-Semitism, it did sort of structure German politics, but not because it was the most important issue in and of itself. There are lots of historians who have made the observation that Germans eventually became anti-Semites in the 1920s or 30s, sort of after they became Nazis, and they usually became Nazis for other reasons. Hitler himself is no doubt an exception to that point, and some of Hitler's inner circle are no doubt an exception to that point. But the millions of Germans who followed them, it wasn't their primary point, but it was a glue that could make the primary point work.
And to just sort of bring you both in for one last bit of this, I mean, part of this then ties in with this sort of anti-elitist, anti-establishment idea, because of course that is also wrapped up with, you know, the prevalence of Jews in the elites, and particularly in the intellectual elites. And we see this not just in the olden days, but of course now as well. And this is really a strong feature. My good friend, Michael Gove, who's a British parliamentarian of the Tory party, said, you know, this is not the day of experts. You know, this is the repudiation of experts. And that's very much a thing now, which, you know, coming from a think tank is really not awesome, I have to say. But how widespread do you think that is? I mean, because I see that I do actually see that on the left and the right, that, you know, you people screw everything up. It's basically, you know, you people, for once, you know, it's not just Jews, it's also you experts. You people, you Jews, and you experts, you screw everything up. Talk a little bit about it, both of you, and then think about your brilliant questions.
So I think there are really three components to radical right politics, none of which are limited to the right by definition. Okay, so there's nationalism in various forms. There's populism, which is what you're getting at, and then there's authoritarianism. And you know, it is very true that there have been historical examples of them on both sides of the political spectrum. And populism is just as often used by the left nowadays in Europe and in the United States to some degree as it is on the right. Nationalism, too, is in no way sort of inoculated from being used by the left. So there was a strong anti-immigrant and racist threat in the labor movement in the United States and same thing in Europe. And authoritarianism we've seen on the left and right. It's enough to look at Latin America. So just empirically, it is the case that nowadays the radical right in Europe and the US has figured out a particularly useful winning combination of these three elements that has given it quite a bit of success. But populism shares these features across the left and the right, that it's really a way of looking at the world in this kind of black and white Manichaean way, where it's some sort of a vilified elite that's seen as morally awful, has betrayed the interest and the trust of the people. And that elite can be, you know, you can fill in your favorite elite. So it can be Wall Street bankers, it can be politicians, it can be experts, but it leads to this general distrust of expertise.
But I think you got the phrase exactly right. You have betrayed the interests of the people. And of course, the people are who I decide who the people are. And that, of course, has lots of resonance with the era that you're talking about as well, right? The betrayal of the people. Okay, you are the people. Do you have questions? Okay. Oh, that's right. You're not allowed to ask your own questions. You might ask something terrible. I'm going to interpret it and ask the questions I want and pretend that they're yours.
I'd just like to really quickly make a point on that, which is...
As long as it's really quickly.
Really quickly. You know, I think it's... Nazi anti-intellectualism and anti-expert feeling was absolutely impossible to separate and was intrinsically all tied up with Nazi racism. Best example I could give you is nuclear physics. You know, Einstein and relativity and all that, Hitler and the Nazis said, this is Jewish physics, we want German physics. And we all ought to be mighty grateful for that, because had it not been for the anti-Semitic policies of the regime, there are a few shiploads of brilliant Jewish physicists who left Central Europe and came here, so Hitler didn't get the bomb before we did. It would have been bad if that had happened. So there you go.
Yes, there would have been bad. People, stop asking questions. And get better handwriting, too. Okay. Here's an interesting question, which I sort of can read and will slightly interpret. So this is interesting. The relationship between Obama, who was the first black president, and the sort of ethno-nationalist, birther movement, the sort of subtext, oh, you're not really an American. And of course the subtext was not, I don't actually think you're an American. It's because, you had this Kenyan father, yuck. All of those sorts of implications. So I'm not quite sure what the last bit means, but I do think I think that's hugely relevant. And the interesting thing to me, though, is also it's hugely relevant because it was a moment of great pride for African Americans. It was, in essence, turning the corner. One of ours has become a president. This is the ultimate repudiation of slavery, and yet it awoke this other side. Do you see a direct corollary between those two things? Either of you can go for it, but do it briefly because we've got these other 6,000
It's relevant
questions.
in two ways, absolutely relevant in the U.S. case in two ways. One is that every moment of racial progress in the United States has been followed by a backlash. So if you look at the three waves of the KKK, it's pretty clearly visible there, but you can sort of look at it throughout American history. And so this was a backlash that was fueled by the birther movement and by other forms of vilification and delegitimization of President Obama. But at the same time, we should be careful because if you sort of zoom out and look across the European cases and the U.S., there isn't a similar stimulus, that awoke those beliefs in other countries. So there's, again, you have to have a multi-causal story. In Poland, you've got anti-Semitism without Jews, and you've got Islamophobia without Muslims, okay, and no influx of immigrants. So the immigration story doesn't work there, or in Hungary, right? Whereas here, it's clearly, I think the Obama presidency was an important factor in how this unfolded.
Okay.
Did you want to?
Yes. I'll leave it at that.
Yes. No, I think you said it. So for foreign policy to strengthen democracy, we espouse building good institutions and rule of law, strong civil societies, but that these facts are declining in the U.S., which weakens our position to argue for democracy abroad. What do we do to strengthen? So this is an interesting question. We really, as Americans, we really actually believe in our system. We have a pretty good system, but I would say that we're also stuck in the era in which we grew up. This has become increasingly a focus of mine, and social media has changed democracy in our country. And I don't think we've appreciated that. So if I'm stealing whoever's question this was, and I'm adding in another layer of it, because I think this is interesting, and it's something that we haven't touched on together. And this is this issue of social media and democracy and institutions. How does this all? How do we deal with this? How do we contend with this as responsible Americans who believe in our institutions? Especially with this historic, with this historic sort of underpinning. How do you answer the question?
So I actually think the era in which I grew up, you're of course much younger than I am. So
I am much younger than you.
There were some key things that we had better than we have now. I actually think, in my view, there's a kind of historical arc that goes across the 20th century whereby many bad decisions were made in the 1930s, among which I would class isolationism and protectionism, as well as on this side of the ocean, as well as obviously everything much that happened in Germany. And then I think after World War II, there was a remarkable period where for a while, we collectively got a lot of things right. I mean, I think the sort of architecture of the international world created after World War II, trade agreements, alliances, moving towards liberalized trade, democracy spreading, and so on.
If you're going to go decade by decade, I'm going to cut you off. So therefore, we had a lot of things right, which now I fear with World War II and the Depression really no longer living memories, and I've worried about this for a while, we're now losing the force of the thing that made us get a lot of things right. And
And so it's one of the things that
how do
worries
we,
me
okay,
about where we are
okay.
now.
That's fine, okay. But I will tell you, because AEI's done a lot of work on this, because we're old too, and we look back at these things that unified us, and we say exactly the same thing. Those things that you just talked about aren't resonant with young people anymore. I can promise you. Truman, Roosevelt, 10 minutes. Truman, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, yada yada. No. Eyes glaze over. Okay, what about our institutions now? How do we reinvest? Looking at the rebuilding that got done after World War II and in that era, but applying it to now, how do we rebuild the faith in those institutions given everything that's going on? Because in fact, it is those things that crowd out the problem that we're talking about. When you have more faith, all of a sudden this white supremacy stuff, those people become latent again. The Pandora's box begins to close again. How do we do it? Bart.
I'm supposed to have the answers to this? That's a big question.
It is a big question, but it is the question that was asked. I didn't ask this question.
It's extremely difficult. So I'm not sure I would put all the blame on social media. I think
No, of course not. I don't want to be facile.
And the question of whether it's a good system, it's proving to be extraordinarily resilient, right? I mean, so our democratic system is under, some would argue, some strain currently, and it's sort of functioning,
right,
despite the fact that we've got a lot of empty offices, right? Despite the fact that there are all kinds of ways in which a little
right,
bit.
we can bitch till
But the point is that it's so far doing okay.
So?
Although I'm not saying the whole situation is okay. I'm saying in terms of democratic institutions. But you are right that there's been a loss of faith in parties, and this will make you happy both on the left and the right. The third-way politics in the 90s alienated a lot of people from the social democratic parties in Europe, and the Democratic Party in the U.S. also had some setbacks. And in fact, in Europe, social democracy is in massive crisis, and so there isn't a meaningful alternative actually on the left to what the radical right is offering. The center right is moving to the radical right, and you've got essentially polarization. I think polarization, to be honest, is one of the biggest problems that contemporary democracies face. Because it's not just that nationalism is polarizing. All these issues we've talked about are essentially becoming cleavages that are mapped onto partisanship, and as party elites move farther and farther apart from one another, you don't have much in the middle, right? And as a result of that, there is a kind of a potential crisis of representation. And it's not clear how to stop that process, because the process itself is not very well understood. It's partly about primaries, maybe it's partly about redistricting, although only to some degree. It's about all kinds of ideological inclinations. And it's not clear how you take two parties that have drifted so far apart that bipartisanship is almost impossible.
We got something important here, Jacques. Right. And I see you have 5 fingers, but this is something important for us. Because we can talk about the problem until we're blue in the face. We can all talk about how Donald Trump sucks or Hillary was a bad candidate. But the reality is we can't talk meaningfully about how to reinvest in these institutions so that all of those people who are fighting with us, right, contending with us for the votes of rural people who feel disaffected or whoever the heck it is, we can't talk about competing. We're not good enough about talking about competing. That's really, really important. And we need to get better at that. Far-right media figures, that's too easy for us. We can't do that. Okay, wait a moment. Here's an interesting question. So 50% of the country, I agree, I want to know more about this 50% of the country equated being American with white, and then defined, quote, American as having heritage from this continent. Of course, everybody who lives here has heritage from this continent, whether it was from 5 minutes ago or it was from 250 years ago. But I think there's 2 sides to this. One, why is this sense that the birthright of America, it looks one way? Because in fact, the melting pot was really about, we're not allowed to say that anymore, but the melting pot really was about American heritage being all of ours. I'm an immigrant, and I feel as American as anybody else in this room, if not more so.
Well, isn't that under threat?
So no, my view is that, of course, it isn't under threat, that we are enriched by immigrants rather than the reverse.
No, I'm saying, but isn't that way of thinking about Americans that's under threat?
And that's the challenge. So, who is this 50%, and are they, and the funny thing to me is that it hasn't fluctuated.
Right.
So where does that
If
come from?
anything, as I said, it's getting better in the sense that if you look at attitudes toward immigrants, they are improving in the aggregate at the level of the U.S. population. But so you have essentially a steady state in terms of beliefs, but you've got a resorting of those beliefs across parties, right? Which then leads to those beliefs being represented by politicians, which then leads to the reinforcement of these ideas in the public sphere. And that's a serious problem. So that is part and parcel of the polarization issue I talked about.
So what AEI would say to this is the failure of civic education. This is the diminution. One of the things that happens is this is the diminution of civic education because we are not teaching our children that in fact everybody is an American, that all these people are Americans, and that to be American is not, in fact, to have come over on the Mayflower and to look like those people who were, as one of my colleagues so nicely said, boat people.
Well, the problem with that is when you get into actual battles over educational curricula across the states.
It's a hideous,
right?
it's a hideous nightmare as well. Okay.
There's also what we say and what students get. You know, I mean, I keep a file of what I call exam howlers. You know.
Oh no! As a former student, I knew it.
The liberation of Europe began when the Allies invaded Omaha, stuff like that. So.
Well, you know, Omaha does need liberation from certain ideas.
Indeed.
Okay, we are at the final moment. I want your last brilliant, positive thought about how it is that the forces of good and people with capes can, in fact, overcome the challenge that we have talked about all day today, which is resurgent white nationalism, resurgent hating, resurgent racism, resurgent anti-Semitism. Okay, how can this work? What's the good news? Do it.
All right. Well, if I could actually come back to a point you made, and if my hypothesis is right that the hate doesn't necessarily come first, what we need are policies that will bring the 40% or so of people who seem potentially white nationalists, or 50%, bring them sort of back into the tent. I think basically that means better policies of economic justice, better job training, better redistribution, things like that. Probably not really on your agenda, but that's those are things that I think.
We spend more time on poverty studies, on prison reform, on jobs for felons than any other think tank in this town. So yes,
Okay.
It is on my agenda.
Good. So we got some bipartisanship happening. We're off to a good start.
No, that's the agenda of the right. Go ahead.
So, you know, depending on what mood I wake up in the morning, I'm either full of doom or full of hope. I think there is a positive scenario one can paint. That is that, you know, this is sort of the last throw of white supremacy, and demographic change will do its own part, and that hopefully there will be more meaningful talk about economic justice and racial equality in this country. And that's certainly possible. I mean, demographic trends are moving toward a greater diversity. We know that. In terms of how that plays out electorally, it's complicated because it's concentrated in democratic states and urban centers and so forth. But there is kind of there are movements happening. Young people want change. Young people want economic justice. There is a big change in the Democratic Party. Hopefully, there'll be change in the Republican Party as well. And I can imagine a scenario that is more positive than the doom and gloom that I usually talk about.
Excellent. See? They believe in something good. Thank you both so much. Thank you all. I hope I got to most of the questions. Thank you for inviting me.